January 6, 1945. London, England. The telegram arrived at 10 Downing Street on a grey winter morning, carried through corridors still scarred by German bombs. It was marked urgent, routed through military channels, encoded with the standard cipher protocols of wartime communication. Inside, Prime Minister Winston Churchill sat at his desk, a glass of whiskey within reach despite the early hour, maps of Europe spread before him like a surgeon's instruments. The Allied advance had stalled. The Germans had unleashed hell in the Ardennes forest. American blood had soaked the snow of Belgium, and now, as Churchill unfolded the decrypted message, he discovered that one of his own generals had decided to twist the knife. The words were Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery's. They were not meant for Churchill's eyes, not directly. They had been intercepted, quietly, discreetly, by intelligence officers who understood that certain private communications, even between Allied commanders, carried implications far beyond their intended audience. Montgomery had been writing to his superiors in the British War Office, offering his assessment of the recent crisis in the Ardennes. His language was technical, professional, wrapped in the jargon of military analysis. But beneath the clinical prose lay something else: contempt. Montgomery had described the American forces as poorly led, incompetently organized, and fundamentally responsible for the disaster that had nearly split the Allied front in two. Churchill read the telegram twice. Then he set it down, slowly, as if handling a grenade with the pin already pulled. Montgomery had always been difficult. Churchill knew this. Everyone knew this. The Field Marshal was a man of rigid discipline and towering ego, a commander who planned his battles with the precision of a mathematician and expected the world to conform to his calculations. He had earned his reputation at El Alamein, where he had shattered Rommel's Afrika Korps and given Britain its first decisive victory of the war. He had led the British and Canadian forces through Normandy, across France, into Belgium and Holland. He was competent, careful, and utterly convinced of his own brilliance. But competence, Churchill understood, could be more dangerous than incompetence when paired with arrogance. And arrogance, when directed at an ally upon whom Britain's survival depended, could destroy more than battles. It could destroy nations. The Battle of the Bulge had been a nightmare. On December 16, 1944, Hitler had launched his last great gamble, a massive offensive through the Ardennes, aimed at splitting the American and British forces, capturing the vital port of Antwerp, and fracturing the Western Alliance. The attack had come through fog and forest, hitting American lines that were thinly stretched and unprepared. Entire divisions had been surrounded. Towns had been overrun. Thousands of American soldiers had been killed, captured, or forced into desperate retreats through freezing woods. For days, the outcome had hung in the balance. The Germans had penetrated 50 miles into Allied territory. They had come within sight of the Meuse River. Panic had rippled through Supreme Headquarters. And then, Eisenhower had acted. He had thrown reserves into the breach, shifted forces across frozen roads, and, critically, he had given Montgomery temporary command of the northern flank of the Bulge, handing him operational control over 2 American armies to coordinate the defense. It had been a pragmatic decision, born of geography and communication failures. The German thrust had severed contact between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and his northern units. Montgomery, operating from the north, could respond faster. Eisenhower had swallowed his pride, overruled objections from his own staff, and made the call. Montgomery had stabilized the line. There was no question about that. His presence had brought order to chaos, his methodical planning had shored up defenses, and his careful counterattacks had helped contain the German penetration. But Montgomery had also seen the crisis through a lens shaped by years of frustration with American command. He had watched Eisenhower's broad front strategy dilute Allied strength across hundreds of miles. He had argued, repeatedly and bitterly, for a concentrated thrust into Germany under British leadership. His leadership. He had been overruled. And now, in the snow and blood of the Ardennes, he believed he had been proven right. So, he had written his assessment, and in that assessment, he had blamed the Americans, not just for tactical errors, but for fundamental incompetence. He had suggested that American leadership was inadequate, that their casualty rates reflected poor training and worse judgment, that the disaster could have been avoided if his own strategic counsel had been heeded. He had written these things in the language of professional military critique, but the message was clear. The Americans had failed, and Montgomery had saved them. What Montgomery had not anticipated was that his words would travel beyond their intended audience. British intelligence officers, reading the telegram, had understood immediately that this was not merely a military report. It was political dynamite. If Montgomery's assessment reached American ears, if it leaked to Eisenhower, to Marshall, to the commanders who had watched their men die in frozen foxholes, the alliance could fracture. American trust in British intentions was already fragile. American generals already suspected that Montgomery saw them as subordinates rather than equals. And American public opinion, which had turned sharply against Britain after Montgomery's perceived slowness in Normandy, would explode if it learned that a British field marshal was privately blaming American boys for their own deaths. So the telegram had been forwarded to Churchill. Quietly. Urgently, with the understanding that the Prime Minister now held in his hands the power to prevent a catastrophe, or to watch helplessly as his most difficult general destroyed the alliance that stood between Britain and oblivion. Churchill stood and walked to the window. Outside, London endured. 5 years of war had left the city scarred but unbroken, its people exhausted but defiant. Britain had survived the Blitz, the U-boats, the years of fighting alone. But survival had come at a price, measured not just in blood and rubble, but in power. The British Empire was bankrupt, its armies sustained by American steel and American money, its future dependent on American willingness to continue the fight. Churchill understood this with brutal clarity. Britain could not win the war without America. And America, increasingly confident in its own strength, no longer needed Britain the way it once had. Montgomery's telegram threatened to sever the thread upon which everything depended. And Churchill, reading those words in the cold January light, knew exactly what had to be done. The Field Marshal would have to be stopped. To understand why Montgomery wrote what he wrote, you must first understand what he saw. You must stand where he stood, in the frozen chaos of late December 1944, and witness the catastrophe unfolding across the snow-covered hills of Belgium. You must see it through his eyes, the broken American units streaming back from the front, the roads clogged with retreating vehicles, the radio networks crackling with desperate calls for reinforcement. You must understand that Montgomery, arriving at the northern shoulder of the German penetration, believed he was witnessing not merely a tactical setback, but the inevitable consequence of American strategic incompetence. The offensive had come as a shock to everyone except, perhaps, the Germans themselves. Hitler had scraped together 25 divisions, stripped from other fronts, gambled on fog and surprise, and aimed his last reserves at the weakest point in the Allied line, the Ardennes sector, held by thinly stretched American units that had been sent there to rest or to gain combat experience in what was considered a quiet zone. The attack had achieved complete surprise. Entire regiments had been shattered in the first hours. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in Europe, had been surrounded and forced to surrender, the largest mass capitulation of American forces in the European theater. The road network had collapsed into confusion. Command posts had been overrun. And for 48 hours, nobody at Supreme Headquarters had a clear picture of what was happening. Montgomery had received the call on December 19. Eisenhower, meeting with Bradley and other commanders at Verdun, had made the decision to split the battlefield. The German thrust had cut communications between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and his two northern armies, Hodge's First Army and Simpson's Ninth Army. They were now isolated on the wrong side of the Bulge, unable to coordinate effectively with Bradley's command. Montgomery, operating from the north, was the logical choice to take temporary control. Eisenhower had made it clear this was an operational necessity, not a change in overall command structure. Montgomery would coordinate the defense of the northern shoulder until the crisis passed. Montgomery had accepted with barely concealed satisfaction. He had driven south immediately through frozen roads and falling snow to meet with the American commanders now under his temporary authority. What he found confirmed every suspicion he had harbored about American military leadership. The Americans, in Montgomery's assessment, were in disarray. Their units were scattered, their defensive positions uncoordinated, their commanders shocked by the speed and violence of the German assault. Montgomery saw officers who had been trained in the doctrines of mobile warfare, aggressive offense, rapid exploitation, relentless forward momentum, now struggling to organize a coherent defense. He saw an army built for victory suddenly confronted with retreat, and he saw, or believed he saw, the fundamental flaws in the American approach to war. Too much confidence, too little caution, too much reliance on material superiority, and not enough on careful planning. He set to work immediately. Montgomery's method was always the same: consolidate, organize, prepare. He pulled units back from exposed positions, shortened the defensive line, established clear boundaries between formations, and built up reserves behind the front. He refused to commit forces piecemeal. He rejected improvised counterattacks. He insisted on knowing exactly where every division was positioned, exactly what supplies they had, exactly what their orders were. It was methodical, cautious, professional. It was also slow, or so it seemed to American commanders accustomed to Patton's racing tanks and Bradley's aggressive maneuvers. But it worked. By December 23, the German advance on the northern shoulder had been halted. Montgomery's forces, including the American First Army under Hodges, had formed a solid defensive line. The Germans, overextended and running short of fuel, could not break through. Meanwhile, to the south, Patton had wheeled his Third Army northward in a feat of logistical brilliance, relieving the besieged town of Bastogne and striking the German flank. By the end of December, the crisis had passed. The Bulge was contained. The Germans were retreating. The Allies had suffered grievous casualties. Nearly 20,000 American soldiers killed, another 60,000 wounded or captured, but the line had held. Montgomery believed he had saved the Americans from disaster. And, in a narrow sense, he was correct. His steady hand had helped stabilize the northern front during the critical days when chaos threatened to turn into rout. But Montgomery saw more than his own contribution. He saw vindication of everything he had been arguing for months. Since the breakout from Normandy, Montgomery had clashed repeatedly with Eisenhower over strategy. Montgomery advocated for a concentrated thrust, all available forces, under a single ground commander, himself, driving northeast through Belgium into the Ruhr industrial region, the heart of German war production. It would be a focused, carefully planned offensive, like the set-piece battles Montgomery had perfected in North Africa and Normandy. Eisenhower, by contrast, favored a broad front strategy, simultaneous pressure all along the line, from the North Sea to Switzerland, preventing the Germans from concentrating their defenses, advancing on multiple axes toward the Rhine. It was a strategy suited to American strengths, overwhelming material superiority, logistical capacity, and aggressive commanders eager to exploit opportunities. Montgomery had argued that the broad front dispersed Allied strength, allowed the Germans to shift reserves, and delayed the final victory. He had presented his case repeatedly, in meetings with Eisenhower, in memoranda to Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff, in carefully worded suggestions that always implied the same conclusion: American strategy was wasteful, American casualties were unnecessarily high, and American command was simply not up to the demands of modern coalition warfare. The Ardennes offensive, in Montgomery's view, proved his point. The broad front had left the Ardennes sector vulnerable. American units had been spread too thin, pursuing too many objectives, with insufficient reserves to respond to a concentrated German attack. If Eisenhower had adopted Montgomery's single-thrust strategy, if forces had been concentrated under proper command, British command, the Germans would never have been able to launch such an offensive. The disaster was not bad luck or German cleverness. It was the predictable result of flawed American leadership. But Montgomery's critique went deeper than strategy. It touched on something more personal, more corrosive. Montgomery had never quite accepted American commanders as equals. He had fought the Germans in North Africa, when the Americans were still learning the basics of desert warfare. He had commanded in Normandy while Patton was sidelined by scandal. He had studied the German army for years, understood their tactics, anticipated their responses. The Americans, by contrast, were newcomers. Rich, confident, powerful, but fundamentally inexperienced. They had courage, certainly, and they had numbers. But courage and numbers, Montgomery believed, were not substitutes for professional competence. And so, in the aftermath of the Ardennes, Montgomery sat down to write his assessment. He wrote to his superiors in London. He wrote in the measured language of military professionalism. He documented the American failures, the inadequate reconnaissance, the thin defensive positions, the slow response to the initial breakthrough, the confusion in the command structure. He noted that his own intervention had been necessary to prevent catastrophe. He suggested, carefully, but unmistakably, that American leadership had been found wanting in the crucible of crisis. He did not write out of malice. Montgomery was not a cruel man, merely an arrogant one. He believed he was stating facts, recording history, providing honest assessment for his superiors. He believed that someone needed to tell the truth about what had happened in the Ardennes, and that truth was that American commanders had nearly lost the war in Europe through their own incompetence. What Montgomery failed to understand was that truth, in wartime, is subordinate to necessity. And the necessity in January 1945 was not honest assessment, but Allied unity. The Americans and British had to fight together, trust each other, coordinate their armies and their strategies, or the war would drag on for years. Personal pride, national rivalry, honest criticism of military performance, all of these were luxuries the Allies could not afford. Montgomery had indulged in that luxury. He had put his professional judgment ahead of political wisdom. He had written words that, if made public or shared with American commanders, would confirm every American suspicion about British arrogance and contempt. He had handed ammunition to those in Washington who argued that Britain was trying to control American forces, claim credit for American sacrifices, and subordinate American interests to British imperial ambitions. He had written the truth as he saw it, and in doing so, he had threatened to destroy the alliance. Churchill, reading that telegram in London, understood what Montgomery did not, that some truths are too dangerous to speak, that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in the fragile bonds of trust between allies, and that no military victory is worth the price of disunity. Montgomery had delivered his honest assessment. Now Churchill would have to deliver his own, not about the Battle of the Bulge, but about the limits of pride and the responsibilities of command. The question was whether Montgomery would listen before it was too late. Churchill did not sleep that night. He rarely did anymore. 5 years of war had trained him to function on brandy, cigars, and a few stolen hours of rest between crisis meetings. But this night was different. This night, he sat in his study with Montgomery's telegram on the desk before him, reading and rereading the words until they burned themselves into his memory. Around him, London was dark. The blackout curtains drawn against German bombers that now came less frequently but still came. The city slept uneasily, as it had every night since 1940. But Churchill remained awake, grappling with a problem that had nothing to do with German bombs and everything to do with British pride. The telegram was not long. Military communications rarely were, but its brevity made it more dangerous, not less. Montgomery had compressed his assessment into a few dense paragraphs. The American dispositions in the Ardennes had been unsound, their response to the German offensive inadequate, their casualties unnecessarily high. He had noted that his own intervention had been essential to restoring order, that British forces had provided backbone to the defense, that the crisis revealed serious deficiencies in American command arrangements. He had concluded with a recommendation that Allied strategy be revised, that a single ground force commander be appointed, with the clear implication that he himself was the obvious choice. Churchill understood military language. He had been First Lord of the Admiralty in the Great War, had planned the Gallipoli campaign, had studied strategy and tactics for decades. He knew how to read between the lines of official reports. And what he read in Montgomery's telegram was not merely professional assessment, but personal indictment. Montgomery was not just criticizing American tactics. He was questioning American competence. He was suggesting that British leadership had saved American forces from their own incompetence. He was, in effect, claiming credit for preventing an American disaster, while simultaneously blaming the Americans for creating that disaster in the first place. It was, Churchill realized, the worst possible message at the worst possible moment. The political situation was more delicate than most people understood. To the British public, to Parliament, to the newspapers that still managed to print despite paper shortages and censorship, the alliance with America was solid, unshakable, the foundation upon which victory would be built. Roosevelt and Churchill were partners, friends even, bound by common language and common purpose. The American armies flooding into Europe were liberators, bringing with them the industrial might that would crush Hitler's Reich. The relationship was special, unique, essential. But Churchill knew the reality beneath the rhetoric. The alliance was not a partnership of equals. It had not been for years. Britain had stood alone in 1940, had fought through 1941 with its back to the wall, had survived only because Hitler had turned east toward Russia. America's entry into the war had changed everything, but not in the way most Britons imagined. America had not joined Britain's war. Britain had, gradually and inexorably, become a junior partner in America's war. The shift had been financial first. By 1941, Britain was bankrupt, unable to pay for the weapons and supplies it needed to continue fighting. Lend-Lease had saved Britain from collapse, but at a price: dependence. American factories now produced the tanks, planes, and ships that British forces used. American loans sustained the British economy. American supplies kept British civilians fed. Churchill had negotiated these arrangements with skill and determination, had maintained the appearance of partnership, but he understood the underlying reality. Britain owed America everything, and debts created obligations. The shift had become military next. In 1942, when the first American divisions arrived in Britain, they had been inexperienced, untested, learning from British veterans who had fought in France, in North Africa, in Greece and Crete. But by 1945, the balance had reversed. American forces in Europe now outnumbered British and Canadian forces combined. American generals commanded the major operations. American strategy dominated Allied planning. Eisenhower, not a British officer, was supreme commander. The armies liberating France and driving toward Germany were predominantly American. Britain was still fighting, still contributing, but the war was no longer being fought on British terms. And with this shift in military power came a shift in political leverage. Roosevelt still consulted Churchill, still valued the relationship, but American policy increasingly reflected American interests, American priorities, American vision for the post-war world. Churchill had watched British influence erode at conferences in Tehran and Quebec, had seen American and Soviet leaders negotiate over Europe's future, while Britain was reduced to commenting from the sidelines. The British Empire, once the greatest power on earth, was now sustained by American support and dependent on American goodwill. This was the context in which Montgomery's telegram had arrived. This was why Churchill had not slept. Because if Montgomery's assessment became public, if American commanders learned that a British field marshal was privately blaming them for the Ardennes disaster, the fragile edifice of Allied unity would crack. American generals, already suspicious of British motives, would see confirmation of their worst fears, that Britain viewed them as incompetent, that Montgomery wanted supreme command not to win the war more efficiently, but to claim victory for Britain, that British criticism of American strategy was motivated by imperial rivalry rather than military necessity. American politicians would be worse. Congress, never entirely comfortable with the alliance, would seize on Montgomery's words as evidence that Britain was ungrateful, arrogant, attempting to control American forces while American boys died in Belgian snow. Isolationists, still influential despite Pearl Harbor, would demand that American troops be withdrawn from British command, that American strategy be independent of British interference. The American press, already inclined to portray Montgomery as overly cautious and self-promoting, would crucify him, and by extension, British military leadership. And Roosevelt, facing domestic political pressure, might be forced to distance himself from Churchill. The special relationship, that carefully maintained bond of trust and cooperation, could dissolve. Not immediately, perhaps, not dramatically, but gradually, as suspicion replaced confidence, as American leaders concluded that Britain could not be trusted, that British interests diverged too sharply from American interests. The alliance would survive, Hitler was still undefeated, the war still had to be won, but it would become transactional, formal, stripped of the personal trust that Churchill had worked so hard to build. Churchill had seen alliances collapse before. He had watched the French Third Republic fall in 1940, had seen French generals blame British forces for their own defeats, had witnessed how recrimination and distrust could destroy military cooperation even as German tanks rolled through Paris. He had no intention of allowing the Anglo-American Alliance to follow the same path. But the problem was not merely political. It was also personal. Montgomery was not some junior officer whose indiscretion could be quietly buried. He was a field marshal, a national hero, the victor of El Alamein. The British public adored him. Parliament respected him. The king had honored him. Montgomery's reputation was tied to Britain's self-image as a military power, as a nation that still mattered, that still won battles, that still produced great commanders. To publicly rebuke Montgomery would damage British prestige. To remove him from command would look like capitulation to American pressure. Yet, to do nothing was impossible. Montgomery's telegram might already have been shared with other British officers. Copies might exist in files that American intelligence could access. The assessment might leak through careless conversation, through deliberate indiscretion, through the simple inability of secrets to remain secret in wartime. And even if the telegram never became public, Montgomery's attitude would. He had already made his views clear in private conversations. American commanders knew he was critical of their performance. If Montgomery continued to speak as he had written, if he repeated his assessment to other British officers, to visiting dignitaries, to war correspondents, the damage would be irreparable. Churchill stood and poured another whiskey. Outside, dawn was breaking over London, gray light seeping through the blackout curtains. In a few hours, he would meet with the chiefs of staff, discuss operations, review intelligence reports, make the 1,000 decisions that total war demanded. But first, he had to deal with Montgomery. He sat back down at his desk and began to compose his response. Not a telegram. This was too important, too sensitive for coded military communications. A personal letter, to be delivered by courier, to be read by Montgomery alone. Churchill chose his words carefully. He would not accuse Montgomery of disloyalty. That would only provoke defiance. He would not question Montgomery's military judgment. That would wound the Field Marshal's pride beyond recovery. Instead, Churchill would appeal to Montgomery's sense of duty, his understanding of strategic necessity, his intelligence. Because Montgomery was intelligent, however arrogant. He understood grand strategy, understood that wars were won through coalition, understood that Britain's survival depended on American partnership. Montgomery had simply forgotten, in the heat of his frustration with American command, that military criticism had political consequences. He had thought like a professional soldier when he needed to think like a statesman. Churchill would remind him, gently, firmly, unmistakably. The letter would be measured, reasonable, devastating. It would explain exactly what was at stake, exactly why Montgomery's assessment, however accurate militarily, was strategically catastrophic. It would draw the line between honest criticism and alliance-destroying contempt. It would make clear that some truths, however factual, were too dangerous to speak aloud, and it would give Montgomery one chance to step back from the precipice before Churchill pushed him over. The Prime Minister wrote through the morning, refining phrases, balancing firmness with respect, making absolutely certain that Montgomery would understand the message. This was not a request. This was not a suggestion. This was an order from the Prime Minister to a Field Marshal. Silence yourself. Restrain your pride. Remember that we are all fighting the same war, or face the consequences. Churchill sealed the letter as the sun rose fully over London. He summoned his personal courier and gave explicit instructions. Deliver directly to Montgomery. Wait for acknowledgement. Return immediately. No copies, no records. This conversation would remain private, known only to the two men who mattered. As the courier departed, Churchill allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Montgomery would comply. He had to. The alternative was unthinkable. But as Churchill turned back to the day's other crises, one thought lingered, that the greatest threats to victory sometimes came not from enemies, but from allies. Not from defeat, but from pride. Not from the battlefield, but from the quiet moments when powerful men forgot that wars are won. Together, or not at all. Dwight Eisenhower sat in his office at the Trianon Palace Hotel, staring at a map of Europe that showed lines he no longer entirely trusted. The map displayed Allied positions, German defenses, supply routes, objectives, all the information a supreme commander needed to prosecute a war. But what the map could not show, what no intelligence report could quantify, was the tension now crackling through the Allied command structure like electricity through damaged wire. Eisenhower could feel it in every meeting, every conference call, every carefully worded memorandum from Montgomery's headquarters. Something had shifted in the aftermath of the Ardennes. Something had broken. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The Germans were retreating, their final offensive exhausted, their army bled white by the desperate gamble. American casualties had been horrific. Nearly 80,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in 6 weeks of winter combat. Entire units had been shattered. The 106th Infantry Division had effectively ceased to exist. Small towns across America were receiving telegrams that began with the words, "The War Department regrets to inform you." The butcher's bill for Hitler's last offensive would be paid by families in Iowa and Georgia and Pennsylvania. Families who would demand answers about how such a catastrophe had been allowed to happen. But the battle had been won. That was what mattered, what Eisenhower kept telling himself. The Germans had thrown everything into the offensive, and failed. They had lost irreplaceable tanks, consumed fuel they could not replace, sacrificed divisions they could not reconstitute. The road to Germany was now open. The Rhine was within reach. Victory, so long delayed, was finally inevitable. Yet Eisenhower felt no satisfaction, only a growing sense of unease. And the source of that unease was Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. Montgomery had been necessary during the crisis. Eisenhower accepted that. When the German offensive split the Allied front, when communications failed between Bradley's headquarters and the northern armies, Montgomery's assumption of command had been the pragmatic solution. Montgomery had stabilized the situation, organized the defense, prevented panic from becoming rout. Eisenhower had made the right decision. But Montgomery had not been content with competent management of the crisis. He had begun to act as though his temporary command was vindication of everything he had been arguing for months. He had issued statements to the press emphasizing British contributions to the defense. He had written memoranda suggesting that the Ardennes disaster proved the need for a single ground commander. Himself, he had made comments, carefully phrased but unmistakable, implying that American leadership had been inadequate, and that only British professionalism had saved the situation. Eisenhower had heard these comments secondhand, filtered through staff officers and liaison personnel. Montgomery had been careful not to criticize Eisenhower directly, had maintained the appearance of proper military courtesy. But the message had been clear, and it had reached American ears throughout the command structure. American generals, men who had watched their soldiers die in the Ardennes snow, were furious. They saw Montgomery's comments not as professional assessment, but as British arrogance, as an attempt to claim credit for American sacrifices while simultaneously blaming Americans for their own casualties. Bradley had been in Eisenhower's office twice in the past week, barely controlling his rage. Bradley, normally calm and professional, had called Montgomery insufferable and contemptuous, had suggested that continued cooperation with the Field Marshal was becoming impossible. Patton had been worse. Patton, who never controlled his rage, had told anyone who would listen that Montgomery was a tired little fart, who had done nothing in the Ardennes except slow down the counteroffensive. Even Hodges, whose First Army had been under Montgomery's temporary command, had quietly expressed relief when operational control was returned to Bradley's 12th Army Group. But the anger was not limited to field commanders. It had reached Washington, carried by war correspondents, by visiting congressmen, by the constant flow of reports that moved between European headquarters and the War Department. Eisenhower had received a terse message from General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, inquiring about tensions with British command and reminding Eisenhower, in language that was polite but pointed, that American public opinion was watching, that Congress was watching, that any suggestion of British control over American forces would create political difficulties. Eisenhower understood what Marshall was really saying. Manage this problem, or Washington will manage it for you. And if Washington intervened, if Congress started demanding answers about why American troops were under British command, if isolationist politicians started questioning the entire alliance, then Eisenhower's position as Supreme Commander would become untenable. Roosevelt would be forced to respond to political pressure. The combined chiefs of staff, that careful balance of British and American military leadership, would fracture. The command structure that Eisenhower had worked so hard to build, that had successfully coordinated American, British, Canadian, and French forces across multiple theaters, would collapse. Eisenhower was not a political general. He had spent his career avoiding politics, focusing on logistics and planning and the technical problems of coalition warfare. But he understood power, understood that supreme command rested not just on military competence but on political support from Washington and London. If he lost that support, if either government concluded that he could not manage the alliance, he would be replaced. And his replacement, whoever it was, would inherit a fractured coalition, mutual suspicion, possibly even separate American and British commands advancing into Germany independently, competing rather than cooperating. That could not be allowed to happen. Not now, not when victory was so close. Eisenhower had sacrificed too much, compromised too often, swallowed too many insults to let Montgomery's pride destroy everything. The telephone rang. Eisenhower's chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, entered without waiting for permission. Smith's expression told Eisenhower everything he needed to know. More problems, more complications, more evidence that the alliance was fraying. Montgomery scheduled a press conference, Smith said without preamble. January 7. He plans to discuss the Ardennes battle, his role in the defense, lessons learned. Eisenhower felt something cold settle in his stomach. A press conference. Montgomery was going to speak publicly about the battle, was going to offer his assessment to British and American journalists, was going to shape the historical narrative while memories were still fresh and casualties were still being counted. What's he planning to say? Eisenhower asked, though he already knew the answer. Smith handed him a preliminary statement that Montgomery's headquarters had circulated. Eisenhower read it carefully. The language was measured, professional, carefully avoiding direct criticism. Montgomery praised American courage, acknowledged American sacrifices, expressed confidence in ultimate victory. But beneath the diplomatic prose, the message was clear. Montgomery had taken command of a desperate situation, had organized the defense, had prevented disaster. The implication was unavoidable. American forces had failed. British leadership had saved them. This will destroy us, Eisenhower said quietly. If Montgomery says this publicly, if American newspapers print this, we'll have a full-scale crisis. Bradley will resign. Patton will probably punch Montgomery, and Washington. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Smith nodded. I've already drafted a message to the combined chiefs. We need British intervention. Churchill needs to muzzle Montgomery before he speaks, but Eisenhower shook his head. We can't ask Churchill to silence his most successful field marshal based on American complaints. It would look like we're trying to suppress legitimate criticism, like we're more worried about embarrassment than about learning from the battle. Churchill would have to defend Montgomery, and then we'd have a British-American confrontation at the highest level. Then what do we do? Smith asked. Eisenhower stood and walked to the window. Outside, Versailles looked peaceful, almost untouched by war. The palace grounds were pristine, the gardens carefully maintained despite 5 years of German occupation. It was strange, Eisenhower thought, to be planning the conquest of Germany from the palace where Germany had been humiliated in 1919, where the Treaty of Versailles had been signed, where the seeds of this war had been planted. History moved in circles, repeating patterns, creating new crises from old resentments. We wait, Eisenhower said finally. We hope that someone in London is reading the same intelligence we are, that someone understands what Montgomery is about to do, that someone with authority intervenes before it's too late. And if they don't? Eisenhower turned back to face his chief of staff. Then I'll request that Montgomery be removed from command of 21st Army Group. I'll cite irreconcilable differences, breakdown in command relationships, whatever language is necessary. I'll make it formal, put it in writing to the combined chiefs. And either they'll support me, or they'll replace me. But I will not command an alliance where one of my senior commanders is actively undermining American forces in public statements. Smith looked shocked. He had worked with Eisenhower for years, had never heard him speak so bluntly about removing a commander. That would be the end of the alliance as we know it, he said. Yes, Eisenhower agreed. Which is why I'm hoping, praying, that Churchill acts first. Because if this becomes a formal confrontation between American and British command, nobody wins. Germany wins. Hitler wins. Everything we've fought for since 1941 collapses into national rivalry and wounded pride. The two men stood in silence, contemplating the abyss that had opened before them. Eisenhower had commanded millions of men, had planned the greatest amphibious invasion in history, had coordinated armies across 1,000 miles of front. But all of that meant nothing if the alliance failed. If American and British forces stopped trusting each other, if political leaders in Washington and London concluded that partnership was impossible. Montgomery's press conference was scheduled for the next day. Eisenhower had perhaps 24 hours for someone in London to recognize the danger and intervene. 24 hours for Churchill to understand that Montgomery was about to commit an unforgivable act of political sabotage, disguised as military professionalism. 24 hours to prevent catastrophe. Eisenhower had faced long odds before. He had gambled on Normandy despite terrible weather. He had held the alliance together through disagreements over strategy, clashes of personality, national rivalries. But this felt different. This felt like watching a train wreck in slow motion, knowing the collision was coming, unable to stop it. All he could do was wait, and hope that Churchill, alone among British leaders with the authority and will to stop Montgomery, would recognize what was at stake and act before it was too late. The question was whether Churchill's loyalty to Britain's most famous general would override his understanding of political necessity, whether pride would triumph over pragmatism, whether the alliance would survive contact with Montgomery's ego. Eisenhower returned to his desk and began drafting contingency plans. Plans for command reorganization. Plans for requesting Montgomery's removal. Plans for managing the political fallout if the alliance fractured. He hoped he would never have to use them, but he wrote them anyway, because hope was not a strategy, and supreme commanders did not have the luxury of optimism. The courier arrived at Montgomery's tactical headquarters in the early afternoon, driving through frozen roads in an unmarked staff car that bore no insignia beyond the small flags indicating official British military business. He carried a sealed envelope, marked for the Field Marshal's eyes only, stamped with the Prime Minister's personal seal. Montgomery received it in his command caravan, the same cramped, austere space from which he had directed operations since North Africa, decorated only with maps and a photograph of Rommel, his most respected adversary. Montgomery opened the envelope with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to correspondence from the highest levels of government. He had received messages from Churchill before, commendations after El Alamein, strategic guidance before Normandy, encouragement during the long advance through France. He expected this letter would be similar, perhaps appreciation for his handling of the Ardennes crisis, perhaps consultation on future strategy, perhaps even support for his renewed arguments about concentrated offensive operations under unified command. What he found instead was something he had never encountered in 5 years of war. Winston Churchill's controlled fury, distilled into 3 pages of typescript that read like a legal brief, a strategic assessment, and a career-ending threat, all compressed into the measured language of diplomatic correspondence. Churchill began with courtesy. He acknowledged Montgomery's service, his victories, his undeniable contribution to Allied success. He praised the Field Marshal's handling of the northern shoulder during the Ardennes crisis, his organizational skill, his steady nerve during desperate hours. These were not empty compliments. Churchill meant them sincerely, but they were also preamble. The calm before the storm, the final courtesy extended before the hammer fell. Then Churchill's tone shifted. He addressed, directly and without euphemism, the reports that had reached London regarding Montgomery's private assessments of American command performance. Churchill did not quote from the intercepted telegram that would have revealed British intelligence operations to Montgomery, would have exposed the extent of monitoring even among Allied commanders. Instead, Churchill referred obliquely to communications and assessments that had caused concern in London, that suggested Montgomery harbored serious criticisms of American military leadership, that implied the Field Marshal believed British competence had rescued American incompetence in the Ardennes. Churchill's next paragraph was surgical in its precision. He explained, in language that assumed no counter-argument, why such views, however sincerely held, however supported by tactical evidence, could not be expressed, could not be shared with subordinates, could not become the basis for official assessments or public statements. The reason was not military, but political. Churchill laid out the reality that Montgomery seemed to have forgotten. Britain was dependent on American power. Not temporarily, not as a matter of convenience, but fundamentally and irreversibly. The British Empire was bankrupt. British industry was producing at maximum capacity and could not expand further. British manpower was exhausted. There were no more divisions to recruit, no more young men to conscript. Every British soldier fighting in Europe was irreplaceable. American forces, by contrast, were growing stronger every month. American factories were producing equipment that British forces needed. American loans were sustaining the British economy. American diplomatic support was essential to Britain's post-war position. This was not a matter of sentiment or preference. It was mathematics. Churchill included numbers that Montgomery, focused on tactical operations, might not have fully grasped. American forces in Europe now numbered over 3 million men. British and Canadian forces numbered less than 1 million. American supply lines stretched across the Atlantic, sustained by industrial capacity that dwarfed Britain's. The liberation of Europe, the defeat of Germany, the occupation of post-war Germany, all of this would be accomplished primarily by American power, with British forces playing an important but ultimately secondary role. Montgomery, reading these figures in the cold privacy of his caravan, felt something he rarely experienced: uncertainty. He had known, abstractly, that American forces outnumbered British forces, but he had not internalized what that meant for command relationships, for strategic authority, for Britain's ability to influence Allied decision-making. He had thought of himself as the senior professional, guiding less experienced American commanders through the complexities of European warfare. Churchill was explaining, patiently but unmistakably, that professional competence was irrelevant if it came attached to political toxicity. Churchill's letter continued with a lesson in alliance management that Montgomery had never learned at Sandhurst or in Staff College. Alliances, Churchill explained, were not based on objective assessment of military competence. They were based on trust. And trust, once broken, could not be restored by victory or vindication or any amount of professional correctness. If American commanders came to believe that their British counterparts viewed them with contempt, if American generals concluded that British criticism was motivated by imperial arrogance rather than military necessity, if American political leaders decided that Britain was attempting to control American forces while blaming Americans for British strategic preferences, then the alliance would fracture. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, inevitably, as American leaders withdrew into independent command, as coordination became formal rather than cooperative, as the special relationship dissolved into mutual suspicion. And Britain, alone in post-war Europe, facing a devastated continent and an emboldened Soviet Union, would pay the price for Montgomery's professional pride. Then Churchill delivered the killing stroke. He informed Montgomery that a press conference had been scheduled for January 7th, now just hours away, at which the Field Marshal apparently intended to discuss his role in the Ardennes battle. Churchill did not ask Montgomery to cancel the conference. He did not request that Montgomery moderate his remarks. He ordered, with the full authority of His Majesty's government, that Montgomery would deliver a statement Churchill's staff had prepared, that Montgomery would not deviate from that statement, that Montgomery would praise American courage and leadership without qualification or caveat, and that Montgomery would explicitly attribute the victory in the Ardennes to American resilience and General Eisenhower's strategic coordination. The prepared statement was attached to Churchill's letter. Montgomery read it with growing disbelief. It was everything he had not planned to say. It emphasized American sacrifice, American determination, American tactical flexibility. It described Montgomery's role as merely assisting American commanders, as providing support to forces that had never lost their fighting spirit. It contained not a single word of criticism, not the slightest suggestion that American dispositions had been faulty, or that British intervention had been decisive. It was, Montgomery realized, a humiliation. Churchill was requiring him to publicly deny his own professional judgment, to praise American performance he privately believed had been inadequate, to claim that his intervention had been marginal when he knew it had been essential. Churchill was demanding that Montgomery lie, not for military necessity, but for political convenience. Montgomery's first instinct was refusal. He was a field marshal, not a politician. He served the king, not the prime minister's domestic political calculations. His duty was to win battles, not to manage American sensitivities. If the Americans could not accept honest professional criticism, if they required constant praise and validation, then perhaps they were not ready for the responsibilities of coalition command. But Montgomery was not merely arrogant. He was also intelligent. And as he read Churchill's letter a second time, he began to understand what was actually being communicated beneath the formal language and diplomatic phrasing. Churchill was not asking Montgomery to lie for political convenience. Churchill was explaining that Montgomery's professional judgment, however accurate, was strategically irrelevant if it destroyed the alliance. That winning battles meant nothing if it lost the war. That Montgomery's duty was not merely to defeat Germans, but to preserve the coalition that made defeating Germans possible. And Churchill was warning, not threatening, but warning, that if Montgomery persisted in his current course, if the press conference proceeded as Montgomery had planned, if American commanders concluded that continued cooperation with Montgomery was impossible, then the Prime Minister would have no choice but to remove Montgomery from command of 21st Army Group, not as punishment, but as necessity, because the alliance was more important than any individual commander, however competent or decorated or beloved by the British. Montgomery read the letter a third time, looking for ambiguity or negotiating room. He found none. Churchill had written with absolute clarity, had left no space for misinterpretation. The choice was binary: comply with Churchill's directive, deliver the prepared statement, accept the humiliation, and continue commanding British forces in Europe. Or refuse, proceed with his own assessment, vindicate his professional judgment, and accept removal from command. Montgomery stood and walked to the small window of his caravan. Outside, British soldiers were preparing for the next offensive, the next advance into Germany. They trusted him. They had followed him from North Africa through Normandy to the Rhine. They believed in his competence, his professionalism, his careful planning that minimized British casualties. They deserved a commander who told the truth, who defended British interests, who did not bow to American pressure. But they also deserved a commander who understood grand strategy. And grand strategy, Montgomery was beginning to understand, meant that some truths could not be spoken, some judgments could not be shared, some professional opinions had to be subordinated to political necessity. He returned to his desk and read Churchill's prepared statement once more. It was anodyne, inoffensive, devoid of any claim to British decisiveness. It would satisfy American commanders without enlightening anyone about what had actually happened in the Ardennes. It was, in other words, precisely the kind of political compromise that Montgomery had spent his career. But it was also an order from the Prime Minister, backed by the clear threat of dismissal if Montgomery disobeyed. Montgomery made his decision with the same cold calculation he applied to military operations. He would comply. He would deliver Churchill's statement. He would praise American performance and minimize British contributions. He would accept the humiliation, because the alternative, removal from command, public controversy, rupture in the alliance, was strategically unacceptable. He drafted a brief reply to Churchill, confirming receipt of the Prime Minister's letter, acknowledging the directive regarding the press conference, and expressing understanding of the political situation. The reply was formal, correct, and utterly devoid of enthusiasm. Montgomery would comply, but he would not pretend to be happy about it. As he sealed the envelope, Montgomery felt something unfamiliar. Not quite shame, but a recognition that professional competence was not the same as strategic wisdom, that winning battles was not the same as winning wars, and that his role was not to judge American commanders, but to defeat Germany in cooperation with American power. The press conference would proceed as Churchill had ordered. Montgomery would read the prepared statement. He would praise Eisenhower and Bradley, and even Patton, men he privately believed were inferior to British professional standards. He would claim that his intervention in the Ardennes had been modest, supportive, merely helpful. And he would hate every word of it. But he would do it, because Churchill had explained, in language even Montgomery's pride could not ignore, that the alliance was more important than any commander's ego, that Britain's survival was more important than British generals' reputations, and that Montgomery's duty was not to vindicate his professional judgment but to preserve the coalition that alone could defeat Hitler. The lesson was bitter, but Montgomery learned it, not gracefully, not willingly, but completely. He had, and in that silence, the alliance survived. The journalists assembled in a requisitioned Belgian schoolhouse, crowding into a room that still smelled of chalk dust and children's lunches, though the children had long since been evacuated. British correspondents sat on one side, Americans on the other, an unconscious division that reflected the tensions everyone present could feel, but that professional courtesy prevented them from acknowledging openly. They had come expecting controversy, perhaps even confrontation. Montgomery's press conferences were always newsworthy, but this one, scheduled in the immediate aftermath of the Ardennes crisis, promised something more. The Field Marshal's assessment of the battle, his view of American performance, his judgment on what had gone wrong, and who bore responsibility. The American correspondents arrived with skepticism already hardened into hostility. They had spent weeks with American units in the Ardennes, had watched young soldiers die in frozen foxholes, had written stories about courage and sacrifice that would appear in newspapers across the United States. They had also heard rumors, whispered complaints from American officers, carefully worded critiques from Montgomery's staff, suggestions that the British view of the battle differed sharply from the American narrative. They expected Montgomery to claim credit, to emphasize British contributions, perhaps to suggest that American leadership had been inadequate. They were prepared to be outraged. The British correspondents were more sympathetic, but no less expectant. They knew Montgomery's reputation for professional confidence, bordering on arrogance. They had reported on his victories, had watched him rebuild British military prestige after years of defeat. If Montgomery believed the Americans had mishandled the Ardennes crisis, if he thought British intervention had been decisive, then surely he would say so. The British public deserved to know their Field Marshal's assessment, deserved to understand that British forces had played a crucial role in the victory. Montgomery entered precisely on schedule, accompanied only by his chief of staff. He wore his customary beret and battle dress, the studied informality that had become his trademark. But something was different. The correspondents, experienced in reading military commanders, noticed immediately Montgomery's expression was controlled, almost rigid. His usual confidence, the slight smile, the easy manner of a man supremely assured of his own competence, was absent. He carried a single sheet of paper, holding it as though it were something distasteful. He began without preamble, reading from the prepared statement in a voice that was professional but oddly flat, drained of the personality that usually characterized his public appearances. Montgomery praised the American soldier. He called them courageous, resilient, determined. He described how American units, surprised and outnumbered, had fought desperate defensive battles that had slowed the German advance. He singled out specific actions: the defense of St. Vith, the stand at Bastogne, the counterattacks that had sealed the northern shoulder. He emphasized American casualties, American sacrifice, American determination to hold the line despite overwhelming odds. Then he turned to American command. Here, the journalists leaned forward, expecting the careful criticism, the professional assessment that would confirm. But Montgomery surprised them. He praised Eisenhower's strategic coordination, his rapid response to the crisis, his decision to shift forces and reorganize the command structure. He described how Eisenhower had placed the interests of the alliance above national pride, had made difficult decisions quickly, had maintained unity of purpose during desperate hours. Montgomery acknowledged his own role, but minimized it. He had been given temporary command of the northern sector, he explained, purely as a matter of geography and communications. His task had been to assist American commanders, to provide support where needed, to coordinate defensive operations until the crisis passed. British forces had fought alongside American forces as partners, as allies sharing a common purpose. The victory in the Ardennes belonged to the Allied forces collectively, but especially to the American soldiers who had borne the heaviest burden and paid the highest price. Montgomery concluded by emphasizing Allied unity. The German offensive had failed, he said, not because of any single commander's brilliance, but because American, British, and Canadian forces had fought together, had trusted each other, had subordinated national pride to common purpose. The lesson of the Ardennes was not about individual competence or national superiority, but about the strength of the coalition that bound the Western Allies together. He finished reading and looked up. The room was silent. The American correspondent stared at him with expressions ranging from suspicion to confusion. This was not the Montgomery they had expected, not the arrogant British Field Marshal who would claim credit while minimizing American contributions. This was something else entirely. A carefully calibrated statement designed to give offense to no one and credit to everyone. The British correspondents looked. Where was Montgomery's professional assessment? Where was the honest evaluation of what had gone wrong? Who had made mistakes? How the crisis might have been prevented? Where was the Field Marshal they knew? The man who never hesitated to speak uncomfortable truths about military performance? Questions followed, but Montgomery deflected them with practiced efficiency. Asked about specific tactical decisions, he praised American commanders by name. Asked about his own intervention, he repeated that his role had been merely supportive. Asked whether the crisis revealed strategic flaws in Allied planning, he emphasized that no plan survived contact with the enemy. That the important thing was how quickly the Allies had adapted, how effectively they had responded. It was a masterclass in saying nothing while appearing to say everything. Montgomery had answered every question without providing any information that could be construed as criticism. He had acknowledged British contributions without claiming British superiority. He had praised American performance without qualification. The American correspondents filed stories that were cautiously positive. Montgomery had surprised them, had shown unexpected grace, had given credit where credit was due. The British correspondents were more disappointed. Their stories emphasized Montgomery's modesty, his emphasis on Allied cooperation, but lacked the controversy or professional insight that would have made front-page news. Within hours, transcripts of the press conference reached Eisenhower's headquarters. The Supreme Commander read them twice, looking for hidden criticism or subtle implications. He found none. Montgomery had said exactly what needed to be said, had praised American forces without reservation, had minimized his own role almost to the point of self-effacement. Eisenhower felt something close to relief, though he remained suspicious. Montgomery did not change his views overnight, did not abandon professional judgments simply because they were politically inconvenient. Something had happened. Some intervention from London? Some pressure that had forced the field marshal to recant publicly opinions he almost certainly still held privately. Eisenhower called Bedell Smith into his office and showed him the transcript. Churchill got to him. Smith said immediately, "This isn't Montgomery speaking. This is Montgomery reading someone else's words. I don't care whose words they are," Eisenhower replied. "What matters is that Montgomery said them publicly, on the record, where American commanders and American newspapers can see them. The crisis is contained." But Smith was less certain. For now. But Montgomery hasn't changed his mind about American competence. He's just been ordered to keep quiet about it. How long before he forgets that order? Before his ego overrides his discipline? It was a fair question, and Eisenhower had no good answer. Montgomery had been silenced, but silencing was not the same as convincing. The field marshal still believed what he believed, still saw American command through the lens of British professional standards, still thought his strategic vision was superior to Eisenhower's broad front approach. Churchill had forced Montgomery to suppress those views, had threatened consequences severe enough to compel compliance. But threats only worked as long as the person making them remained willing to enforce them. Still, the immediate danger had passed. Montgomery's press conference had not exploded into an alliance-ending controversy. American newspapers would report Montgomery's generous praise rather than British arrogance. American commanders would see evidence that Montgomery could be professional, could subordinate pride to alliance necessity. The fragile trust that held the coalition together had been preserved. The Allied advance could continue. Within weeks, Eisenhower's forces would reach the Rhine, would cross into Germany itself, would begin the final campaign that would end with Hitler's suicide in a Berlin bunker and German unconditional surrender. American and British forces would fight side by side through those final months, would coordinate attacks and share intelligence and celebrate victory together. But the underlying tensions never entirely disappeared. Montgomery continued to believe that his strategic vision had been correct, that concentrated offensive operations under unified command would have ended the war sooner and at lower cost. American commanders continued to resent Montgomery's condescension, his implication that British professionalism was superior to American determination. The alliance held together not because those tensions were resolved, but because leaders on both sides recognized that preserving the coalition mattered more than vindicating their own judgments. Montgomery had learned a bitter lesson, that professional competence was subordinate to political necessity, that winning battles meant nothing if it lost alliances, that commanders served not merely their own forces, but the broader strategic purpose that gave military operations their meaning. He had learned it reluctantly, under threat of removal from command, forced to publicly praise performance he privately judged inadequate. But he had learned it. And in that learning, painful as it was, the alliance survived long enough to win the war. The press conference ended. The journalists dispersed to file their stories. Montgomery returned to his headquarters, where he filed Churchill's prepared statement in his personal papers, not as something he was proud of, but as evidence of a moment when political necessity had overridden military judgment, when alliance management had proven more important than honest assessment, when a field marshal had been forced to choose between pride and duty. He had chosen duty. Grudgingly, resentfully, but completely. And 3 months later, when German forces surrendered unconditionally, when Allied flags flew over Berlin, when the war in Europe finally ended, Montgomery could claim his share of victory. Not the vindication he had wanted, not the recognition that his strategic vision had been superior, but something more important. The knowledge that he had subordinated his ego to the alliance, had accepted humiliation rather than fracture the coalition, had learned, too late to avoid the rebuke, but soon enough to matter, that wars are won together or not at all. Churchill had silenced him. Eisenhower had contained him. History would judge whether they had been right. But the alliance had survived, and in 1945, With Hitler's Reich collapsing and Europe in ruins, that survival was all that mattered. Winston Churchill stood on the balcony of the Ministry of Health building in Whitehall, looking out over a sea of faces that stretched as far as his aging eyes could see. 1 million people, perhaps more, packed into the streets of London, celebrating the end of 6 years of war. They waved flags, sang patriotic songs, embraced strangers with the wild joy of those who had survived the unsurvivable. Church bells rang across the city, bells that had been silent since 1940, reserved by law for warning of invasion, now freed to proclaim victory. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Britain had endured. Churchill raised his hand in the V for Victory salute that had become his trademark, and the crowd roared its approval. He was 70 years old, exhausted by half a decade of crisis management, sustained by cigars and brandy and a constitution that seemed fueled by sheer willpower. He had led Britain through its darkest hours, had held the nation together when invasion seemed imminent, had forged the alliance that had ultimately crushed Nazi Germany. This was his moment of triumph, the vindication of every difficult decision, every compromise, every midnight telegram sent across the Atlantic to cajole and persuade the Americans to stay engaged in Europe's war. But even in this moment, even as the crowd celebrated below, Churchill's mind returned to a cold January morning 4 months earlier, to a telegram that had threatened to destroy everything he had built, to Montgomery's pride and the lesson Churchill had been forced to teach. The incident had remained secret. The British and American publics knew nothing of Montgomery's intercepted assessment, nothing of Churchill's intervention, nothing of how close the alliance had come to fracturing over a field marshal's professional vanity. The press conference in January had been reported as Montgomery's generous tribute to American forces, his gracious acknowledgement of Allied cooperation. No journalist had suspected it was a forced statement, dictated from London, delivered under threat of dismissal. The crisis had been contained, managed, resolved, without public spectacle or lasting damage. But Churchill had not forgotten. The episode had crystallized something he had understood intellectually, but had now experienced viscerally, that alliances were fragile constructions, held together not by treaties or formal agreements, but by trust, restraint, and the willingness of leaders to subordinate their own judgments to collective purpose. Montgomery had nearly destroyed that trust through arrogance, not malicious arrogance, but the arrogance of competence, the belief that professional correctness justified political recklessness. Churchill had seen alliances collapse before. He had watched the Franco-British partnership disintegrate in 1940 as French generals blamed British forces for French defeats, as mutual recrimination replaced cooperation, as two nations that should have stood together instead turned on each other even as German tanks rolled toward Paris. He had learned then that unity required more than shared enemies. It required shared respect, mutual restraint, and leaders willing to silence their own doubts about their allies' competence. The Anglo-American Alliance had been different, more durable, built on deeper foundations. But it had been tested repeatedly, by strategic disagreements, by clashes of personality between commanders, by British suspicion of American inexperience, and American resentment of British condescension. Churchill had spent 5 years managing those tensions, mediating disputes, preventing small disagreements from escalating into alliance-threatening crises. He had learned to read Roosevelt, to understand what the American president needed politically, to frame British requests in terms of American interests. He had cultivated relationships with Marshall and Eisenhower, had praised American forces even when privately worried about their tactical performance, had subordinated British strategic preferences to American priorities when necessary to maintain the partnership. Montgomery had threatened all of that, not through disloyalty or incompetence, but through the simple inability to recognize that professional judgment had to be tempered by political wisdom. Montgomery had been technically correct in many of his assessments. American dispositions in the Ardennes had been flawed. Eisenhower's broad front strategy had dispersed Allied strength. Concentrated offensive operations might indeed have ended the war sooner. But technical correctness was irrelevant if expressing it destroyed the alliance that made victory possible. Churchill had understood this. His years in politics, his experience managing coalitions and parliamentary majorities, had taught him that power flowed not from being right, but from maintaining the relationships that enabled action. Montgomery, for all his military brilliance, had never learned that lesson. He had seen war as a technical problem, solvable through professional competence and careful planning. Churchill saw war as a political problem, solvable only through alliance management and the subordination of national pride to collective purpose. The intervention in January had been necessary, but Churchill had taken no pleasure in it. He respected Montgomery, valued his contributions, understood that the Field Marshal's careful planning had saved countless British lives. But respect could not override necessity. When Montgomery's pride threatened the alliance, when his professional assessments risked alienating American commanders and American political leaders, Churchill had acted without hesitation. The telegram to Montgomery had been one of the most important communications Churchill had sent during the entire war. Not because it changed military strategy or influenced battlefield operations, but because it preserved the political foundation upon which all military operations depended. Grudgingly, resentfully, but completely. He had delivered Churchill's prepared statement at the press conference, had praised American performance without reservation, had minimized his own contributions to the point of self-effacement. It had been humiliating for a man of Montgomery's pride, devastating for a commander who believed his professional judgment was being suppressed for political convenience. But Montgomery had understood, finally, that some truths were too dangerous to speak, that alliances required not just cooperation but careful management of perception, that winning the war mattered more than vindicating his own strategic vision. The lesson had held. Through the final months of the war, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and drove deep into Germany, Montgomery had remained professional, had coordinated effectively with American commanders, had subordinated his ego to operational necessity. There had been no more controversial press conferences, no more private assessments that questioned American competence, no more attempts to claim British superiority or criticize Allied strategy. Montgomery had fought his battles, commanded his armies, and accepted that he would never receive the recognition he believed he deserved for saving the Americans in the Ardennes. But the alliance had survived. American and British forces had advanced together into Germany, had met Soviet forces at the Elbe, had accepted German surrender as partners. The coalition that Churchill had worked so hard to build and preserve had lasted until victory. And that survival, Churchill understood, was worth more than any individual commander's reputation, more than British pride or professional vindication, more than anything except victory itself. Now, standing on the balcony in Whitehall watching London celebrate, Churchill reflected on what the Montgomery episode had taught him about leadership in coalition warfare. It was not enough to be strategically correct, militarily competent, or professionally superior. Leaders had to manage egos, their own and others, had to recognize that pride could be as dangerous as enemy action, had to understand that preserving alliances sometimes required accepting criticism silently, praising allies generously, and subordinating professional judgment to political necessity. This was the lesson Churchill would carry forward into the post-war world. The war in Europe was over, but the alliance would need peace. Britain and America would have to cooperate in occupying Germany, rebuilding Europe, containing Soviet expansion. New challenges would test the partnership. New disagreements would emerge over policy and strategy. But if the lesson of Montgomery's telegram held, if leaders on both sides recognized that alliance management required restraint, humility, and the subordination of national pride to collective purpose, then the partnership could endure. Churchill descended from the balcony and returned to his office at 10 Downing Street. The celebrations would continue through the night, but work remained. Germany had surrendered, but Japan still fought. The occupation of Germany had to be organized. The post-war settlement had to be negotiated with Stalin and Truman, who had succeeded Roosevelt just weeks earlier. Britain's future, diminished by 6 years of total war but determined to remain a great power, had to be secured through careful diplomacy and continued American partnership. Churchill sat at his desk and pulled out a file he had kept locked away since January. Inside was the original telegram from Montgomery, the intercept that had begun the crisis. Churchill read it one final time, remembering his fury when he had first seen those words, remembering how close the alliance had come to fracturing, remembering the cold certainty that Montgomery had to be stopped before his pride destroyed everything. Then Churchill struck a match, lit the telegram on fire, and watched it burn in the ashtray on his desk. The paper curled and blackened, Montgomery's words dissolving into ash. No record would remain of the Field Marshal's assessment, no evidence of the crisis that had threatened to shatter the alliance. History would remember Montgomery as a competent commander, a professional soldier, a contributor to Allied victory. History would not know how close he had come to destroying the partnership that made victory possible. But Churchill would remember. He would remember that arrogance was more dangerous than defeat, that pride could kill alliances more efficiently than enemy action, that the hardest decisions in war were not about strategy or tactics, but about managing the human egos that could turn allies into adversaries. He would remember, and he would apply those lessons as Britain navigated the post-war world. The alliance with America had survived Montgomery's telegram because Churchill had recognized the danger and acted decisively. It would survive future challenges if British leaders continued to understand that partnership required restraint, that influence flowed from trust rather than superiority, that Britain's diminished power could be leveraged only through careful management of the relationship upon which everything depended. The lesson was complete. Montgomery had been silenced. The alliance had survived. Germany had been defeated. And Churchill, architect of victory, understood that the greatest threat to success had come not from German armies, but from British pride, not from enemy action, but from ally arrogance, not from defeat on the battlefield, but from the quiet moment when a field marshal had written words that could have shattered everything. The war in Europe was over, but the struggle to maintain the alliance, to preserve the partnership, to manage the egos and ambitions that could destroy cooperation, that struggle would continue. Churchill had won this battle, had prevented catastrophe through decisive intervention and the willingness to threaten a national hero with dismissal. History would judge whether he had been right to silence Montgomery. But as Churchill watched the telegram dissolve into ash, as London celebrated outside his window, as Britain stood victorious, but exhausted on the threshold of an uncertain future, he knew with absolute certainty that some truths were too dangerous to speak, some judgments too corrosive to share, and some lessons, like the one Montgomery had learned that cold January day, were worth teaching even at the cost of humiliation and pride. The alliance had survived. And in the end, Churchill believed that was all that mattered. Victory belonged not to the commanders who had been most competent or most correct, but to the alliance that had held together long enough to win. Montgomery had played his role, however reluctantly. Churchill had played his, however brutally. And together, Americans, British, Canadians, and all the Allied forces who had fought from North Africa to the heart of Germany, they had achieved what once seemed impossible: the defeat of Nazi Germany and the preservation of the coalition that made that defeat possible. The lesson Churchill never forgot was simple but profound. Wars are won together or not at all. Pride, however justified, is a luxury no alliance can afford. And the greatest service a leader can perform is sometimes not winning battles, but preventing the arrogance of victory from destroying the partnerships that make victory meaningful. Churchill extinguished the last embers in the ashtray and returned to work. The celebrations would continue outside, but inside 10 Downing Street, in the quiet office where Britain's war had been directed, Churchill carried forward the knowledge that leadership meant sacrifice, sometimes of troops in battle, sometimes of pride in victory, sometimes of the truth itself when speaking it would cost more than staying. Silent. Montgomery's telegram was ash. The alliance was intact. The war was won. And Churchill, alone with his thoughts on this day of celebration, understood that the victory belonged not just to those who had fought bravely, but to those who had learned, however painfully, that survival required subordinating ego to duty, pride to partnership, and professional judgment too. The political wisdom that held alliances together when every other force conspired to tear them apart. The lesson was complete. History would unfold from here. But the moment when Churchill had stopped Montgomery from destroying the alliance with his pride, that moment, known to only a few, would stand as testament to a simple truth: that the most dangerous enemies in war are sometimes not the ones firing weapons, but the ones whose arrogance threatens to fracture the unity upon which victory depends. Churchill closed the file and locked it away. The war in Europe was over. The lessons remained. And in the years to come, as Churchill navigated Britain's diminished post-war role, as he watched American power reshape the world, as he worked to maintain the special relationship that alone offered Britain continued influence, he would remember January 1945 and the telegram that nearly destroyed everything. He would remember, and he would never allow pride, his own or anyone else's, to threaten the alliances upon his future depended. That was the lesson Churchill never forgot, and it was, perhaps, the most important victory he ever achieved.